I think you just press.
Maybe you need to stop yours.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so there are several factors why you in the West are not getting as much. Okay. Um, so there are several factors why you in the West are not getting as much coverage as you are getting, as you were getting with the beginning of the Arab Spring a few years ago. And it's not because, I mean, people are getting, I mean, it's not because people, less people are being killed or that the war is over or that the dictators are not in full grip in Egypt, Syria, Libya, Lebanon, Morocco, Algeria, you name it. And it's in, I mean, and it's not because there are thousands of people in jail or in diaspora or being killed on daily basis. It's for so many reasons. On the one hand, we in the Middle East as reporters, we face, like as locals, we face, first of all, that the dictators are in full grip of information. So we risk not only our lives, but we risk, you know, the lives of our families if we decide to report and to give you the full story while based at home. And on the other hand, for Western journalists, there is, number one, the Western governments are actually condoning and supporting our dictators. And on the other hand, it's financially very, very challenging to send journalists to the war and to protect them and to buy insurance and to cover all of these expenses without, you know, taking the moral responsibility and the risks on stories that are not wanted to be covered. And I'm going to, and I don't know if this is because of the lack of interest. Is the audience, have the audience lost interest? You know, there are too many stories of people being killed or living in diaspora or refugees. They don't want to hear about it. Or is it because the story is not being told because of all of these challenges? So I'm going to turn over to I'll introduce everyone first. There is Lina Atalla, founder of Mada Masr, the only independent voice in Egypt, which is banned, as well as over 400 websites banned in Egypt. And Beltru, who was deported from Egypt last year, the independent correspondent. And there is Alia Malik, Syrian journalist and writer, who's also not welcome in Syria for her latest book. I'm going to start with Lina. Our first and biggest challenge as journalists in the Middle East is access. Do we have access to information? With the new media law in Egypt, it makes it impossible, and Lina is going to elaborate on that, to cover stories, basically.
Thank you, Lina. There's no need to repeat the level of difficulty in terms of accessing information in a context like Egypt, where not only legislation is basically standing against journalists and people in general's ability to access information, but there is also an unprecedented tighter grip on the media spectrum in general. So we do live in an era where the intelligence services sends daily WhatsApp messages to the main chief editors of media organizations, be it television stations and newspapers, basically telling them how to cover and how not to cover, or what not to cover certain news. So for example, we know that many chief editors have been asked in Egypt through these WhatsApp messages to completely ignore the news of the protests in Sudan. Something similar has been happening with Algeria as well. Obviously, these are protests that are rendering our governments quite nervous. That said, it's easy to imagine that this is the narrative, and this is very true to a great extent. But I think the fact that we continue to function in Egypt is hinging on that fight for stories and for tips and for information. And I'll just give one example before we carry on with the conversation. A few months ago, we got a tip about a plan by the current authorities to amend the constitution, to basically, introduce substantive and structural changes to the ruling system, how the country is ruled, but also particularly, for example, to give our current president 2 more terms in such a way where he will continue to be in power up until the 2034. We leaked the story, and we found that by insisting on following up on this tip, cultivating the sources, building trust with the kind of people who would want to give us the information, we managed to break something and also raise interest, because what happened is that when we published the story way before the amendments were officially announced and officially endorsed by Parliament, there were a lot of discussions about them from the public. And if we didn't do that, there would have been, not that we've changed anything, the amendments are eventually passing and, will become a fait accompli in the country sometimes very soon. But at least this, give us this at least possibility of having a conversation about how our country is deeply transforming. And I feel like if we can, continue to at least fight this fight, that gives us a raison d'être, I guess.
Thank you, Lina. I'm going to pass on to Belle now.
So I cover the entire Middle East region, or try to anyway, which is obviously quite a large scope. And I think one of the things that I think the readership of our newspapers don't quite realise is that access is actually very tough for some of the most important conflicts. And I think that's actually driven a lack of interest in particular conflicts. In my mind, I'm thinking at the moment in particular of Yemen. So Yemen has been under a land, sea and air blockade now for several years, and it is extremely difficult for TV crews or journalists to get in there. And for a very long time, even though it was one of the biggest humanitarian crises in the world, with staggering numbers of people who were suffering famine-like conditions, or who were suffering of cholera, or a million different issues, it wasn't hitting international news. And I think that was largely driven for many reasons. One, that it's a very complicated conflict, but also because of access. At one point, you could get into Sanaa on UN planes. As a journalist, that was then stopped. Now people are getting in through Aden, and people are able to get to some of the hardest to reach areas, but it's extremely difficult and extremely expensive. And I think that had meant that this immense, basically the largest humanitarian crisis in the world, was pretty much relegated to tiny paragraphs in newspapers. That's obviously changing right now, and there's been some fantastic reporting over the last year or two. But for a long time, that meant that this massive problem was basically going almost entirely unreported. And I think largely that's got to do with access. We also have had similar issues in terms of Libya. Interest in Libya has sort of dropped massively over the last year or two. That has got to do with many different reasons, but it is very hard to get into the country, and it's very hard to move around the country. And obviously the country is split largely in two. That's to sort of simplify things, but that does make it very difficult. As an international journalist, I feel there's a sort of large, because we are protected by our passports and by noisy governments, I feel there's a responsibility for us to try and get to areas and assist journalists from those countries in getting the message out. Because ultimately, even if I was deported from Egypt last year, I was just deported, I'm not in jail, and I was not badly treated, and that's largely to do with my passport. So we do have a responsibility to try and push boundaries, and obviously, you know, local journalists, it's a difficult term, but you know, they're often pushing the news agenda, but as a foreign correspondent, we do have to try and get there. Just to sort of wrap up this terms of access, I mean, I just came out of Gaza a few days ago. Gaza is under a 12-year blockade. It is incredibly hard to get into Gaza unless you are a correspondent with, you know, accreditation. And I think, you know, that's a prime example of, you know, when even you just look at it from a perspective of peace, you know, when you have a people who basically have no access to the outside world apart from what they can see on, you know, TVs, that they can't physically get out, people can't physically get in, you have this kind of demonization on both sides, and it's really important basically for international journalists to go into Gaza because they're pretty much the only people who can, and to tell that story. So I think we are seeing, you know, increased restriction on access. I think that does impact news agenda, and I think, I mean, I can only speak as an international journalist, but there is a responsibility there to work against that, and the readership have to understand that.
Hello, hi. Can I see by a show of hands how many people here have been to the Middle East? Okay, that's pretty good. That's a little bit more than your usual American crowd. A little bravi italiani. Okay, I kind of want to get us thinking about these things in a little bit more of a bit more of a macro sense and a little less of a literal access sense, because obviously Syria has been under a dictatorship for now almost 5 decades, and one that now has managed to survive with an incredible amount of impunity. Despite the fact that everything that sort of unfolded in Syria in the last 8 years happened in front of everybody's eyes. So I don't want to focus so much on the things about what it is to practice journalism under a dictatorship, because otherwise we're going to end up repeating a lot of things. Can I see also by a show of hands how many people here are journalists or want to be journalists? Okay, then let's have a conversation among colleagues, because some of the, you know, we've been talking, these are things I have to think about because I teach, I'm the director of international reporting at the City University of New York, and so I have these young minds that I'm supposed to be forming in terms of how they approach their career. So we think about, I mean, I want us to think, we've talked a little bit about access, but I also want us to think a little bit about accessing a story, and that I think there were some failures there that are part of the reason that we don't necessarily have the same kind of attention focused on the Middle East at the moment. So where I wanted to start with was, first of all, the fact was that in 2011 there was so much, at least from the American context, that was already so unknown about Syria. You know, there wasn't like there were, you know, it's not like there were stories coming out of Syria before 2011. And I had always wanted to write a book about Syria, but before 2011 I was always told there wasn't a market. And so when you start reporting on a place in a moment of crises, as if that day in March 2011 is day one, you're already kind of missing the picture, because day one, as often is in the Middle East, was actually, you know, decades, if not a century before. And so entering the story at that point was already asking people to come into a story that they had little context, people who don't know the region, from outside the region, or don't pay attention to it, to understand a story that was not going to be easily entered into. And we asked the same thing actually of a lot of the journalists, because, you know, we kind of practice our field as if you can just be a general practitioner. And I would argue that, in fact, you, especially when covering another country and being responsible for interpreting what is going on in another country, you should have some specialized knowledge. And even to say you cover the Middle East, I would say is too much of a generalist thing. I can cover Syria, but I don't know that I should be covering Yemen necessarily, even if I do speak the language and do have a greater understanding of the context. I mean, each of these places has a specificity that a lot of the journalists or a lot of the people or the editors who were in charge of what got told did not, a context that they didn't necessarily know. And so in a case like that, even when their intentions are great, you're asking people who are writing at 800 word or 1500 word level to really, you know, make up for that massive hole in our sort of communal knowledge about the place. And that kind of led us to see the kind of coverage that we did see coming out of Syria, that I would say, I mean, to be a little provocative, was lazy and resorted to a lot of easy paradigms to understanding the situation, sort of thinking that you could, already these failed paradigms of understanding what was going on in Iraq, trying to transport them and using them to understand what was going on in going on in Syria, and also just from a very practical sense, the experts and the pundits that were called upon. I mean, the journalists sort of went to those that were already in the Rolodex, already out there. And so we are asking a lot of journalists to do that, but I would say then maybe we should consider what a serious responsibility is. Ragazzi, è un po' difficile perché state per tutti noi. Okay, so what I wanted to add also is that part of it is there is like such an attraction to the exoticism, I think, on the part of a lot of journalists to the Middle East, that they ended up writing about the place as if it were a foreign planet, another planet. And I think that is part of the reason readers have tuned out, because it wasn't a recognizable story. It was something so far outside of the norm. And when the dynamics that move societies are, even though each country, each society has its own specific context, the dynamics are the same. It's money, it's power, it's love, it's hate. And these weren't the things that we were talking about. And so we were talking about Shia and Sunnis and Alawites, and not really, we weren't really doing our job to help readers or outsiders access the story. But to speak now something about very specific to Syria that I think has made it quite difficult is that there have been some seriously malicious disinformation campaigns by a lot of the nation states that are obviously interested in what happens in Syria. Obviously talking about, I mean, Russia comes to mind most readily. And I would say that this sort of disinformation, this playing with the idea that Syria, what is happening in Syria is not because Syrians wanted a different life, but rather because it was internationally sort of instigated conspiracy, playing with enough of the truth that it sort of seems kind of truthful to people who think, who aren't of bad intentions, but can relate to the idea that there have been these, malintentioned interventions from countries outside of the Middle East into the Middle East. And this is something that I think has caused so much confusion and disinterest on the part of people, because if you can't really know what the truth is, and this is something that the Syrian regime recognized very early on. I mean, before Donald Trump was talking about fake news, Bashar al-Assad was saying that what we were seeing in Syria was a set that Al Jazeera had built somewhere else. So this, and saying that this wasn't really real. And so in this kind of environment, it becomes hard for even people of good intentions to access the story, I mean, as in readers, not as in journalists, and to understand the story, and to want to try to tune in. At that point, if it's impossible to understand this, if it's impossible to know which story is the true story, then why pay attention? So those are just some major themes I want us to think about, because these are the things that we as journalists can control. We can't control that for now Bashar al-Assad is in power, and that all the tools of the mukhabarat, the Syrian secret police, are still very much in place, but these are things that we can think about in terms of how we define our practice.
Thank you, Alia. I'm going to pick up on that and talk about the risks that we journalists face in our countries. And yes, the risks in Syria are already thousands of people are displaced, journalists in jail or are facing torture and death. And in Egypt, with everything under surveillance, there is over 400 websites blocked, and even though they are blocked, we can access them through VPNs. And why the government is doing this is very smart, because instead of watching 100 million people, they can watch the 5,000 that go on the VPN to read stories on websites like Mada Masr, the only independent news website in Egypt, but also CPJ, Committee to Protect Journalists, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. All these websites are blocked. So, instead of watching everyone, they now have a fewer audience to watch. So, Lina, can you talk to us about what kinds of risks are you taking when you decide to report on a story, given the fact that there is lack of information and there is actually a full grip of control from the regime?
Okay, it's not easy to talk about risks without falling also into a narrative of victimhood, because at the end of the day, again, I'm someone who continues to be able to operate out of Egypt. I don't have a clear explanation as to why we continue to be left alone, even though, as Lina said, we are one of those over 500 websites that have been blocked, and it's a soft kind of censorship that is not costly at all, because it doesn't involve throwing people in jail, which also sort of drives some noise, depending on also who you are and how much access you have to international community and to festivals like this to get the kind of protection and noise. Yeah, I think what we've been facing in terms of risks is this very informal and subtle forms of intimidation, whereby our lawyers, for example, would be someone then talk to against basically working with us. We've had experiences with journalists cooperating with us without being on our staff, also being called and asked to gently, to stop working with us, but to also sort of continue informally working with us to become sources of information about our newsroom to the authorities. So we've been having these, soft and informal forms of intimidation, whereby, we know that we are surrounded, we know that they talk about us, but it's the kind of thing that if you decide to take too seriously, you'll just stop working. It will keep you busy unnecessarily. So our attitude has been to just, sort of ignore. And, I don't want to sound like we're just courageous and brave and we don't care and all of that. But it's just, picking, a certain zone through which you can be functional and sort of balancing what feels like a bigger risk. So, I remember that 2 years ago when they decided actually to block the website, and our website was one of the first 7 websites or so to be blocked, so it didn't feel so common for websites to be blocked. I was concerned. I felt that maybe this is the first step towards something more serious. So we closed the offices, we started working from home, we started turning our homes into newsrooms, and soon enough it felt like that was it, a block that became normalized. It's become very hard for people to read our website, but no one really came to us. So I'm not trying to say there are no risks. There are plenty of risks. And there is, a day-to-day mitigation of these risks in terms of also the stories that we get, especially the ones that involve, sensitive information. So what I'm trying to say is that it's something that we have to negotiate with on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to just submit to the fact that it's impossible to operate. It's close maybe to impossible to operate, but we're not quite there yet. And if we're doing something, the few of us out there, not just Madame Ossa, but the few websites, either smaller websites or independent journalists who are out there, who actually cannot ship those stories to their own mainstream organizations, but go to the smaller websites like us, which are independent and write under pen names. This small community that's out there, is there to basically sort of try to keep that margin somehow until it can widen at some point. The last thing I'll say, I think for me, my experience in my newsroom is the bigger risk really is burnout and loss of hope. I think what I struggled with the most, a lot, especially after the blocking of our website, is actually how the authorities managed to engineer a state of despair that is very hard to deal with. A lot of the people I'm working with are, experiencing burnout. A lot of people are, leaving journalism altogether. A lot of people are writing stories that people cannot access because, we keep sending these links to mirror sites that get blocked and then blocked again. So there is this cat and fight, this cat and mouse game with the government. And I feel that, this is, I think, what I'm fighting against the most. But, the last thing I'll say about this is that, and I was telling my friend Sarah earlier today about it, I feel that it was also a tip for me to also perhaps start working with younger people perhaps who haven't gone through, the ups and downs of 2011 and post, but who have only seen the post, and who are just wanting to imagine a certain ray of possibility. And I feel there is a lot of hope in there. And, ever since, I started working with this idea more, I have sort of revamped my sense of possibility within the newsroom. So,
hope, Yelena. Okay, I think everyone I know in Egypt in the field is very depressed on like several kinds of medication on antidepressants. The risks that we face in Egypt are very different from the risks that we face when covering the war in Yemen or Libya. or Gaza. Or I remember when the war first started in Libya, I went there and I was a freelance journalist with nothing at all. And like all the journalists, the colleagues from Reuters and AFP and several agencies, like they came with bulletproof cars and vests and helmets and all of this, and but now actually all of this does not make you safe. It makes you actually a target. Like all of these kidnappings, are to either steal the bullet-proof vest or the helmet, or to kidnap journalists so that they can they can ask for a ransom. So, Belle, you've been covering that quite extensively over the past couple of years. How have the risks changed today to what they were before?
I mean, I would just start with a bit of a disclaimer, a bit like Lena A did, I suppose. Lena told me, I am an international journalist with a British passport, and I choose to be in these places. So when I talk about risk, ultimately I could just be at home, like covering Brexit, if I wanted to have a death wish in out of boredom. But I do choose to be there. So it's hard for me to talk about the risks that we face without the sort of voice in my head saying, but you don't need to be there, and there are journalists on the ground, and. So that's a disclaimer before I start this. And I mean, what I would say is, in terms of how things have changed, as Lena said, like journalists generally became the targets, whatever nationality you are, and that has impacted the way that people have reported. I think international news outlets got it wrong at the beginning and were relying on freelancers who they were not giving support to, and that is why people ended up being kidnapped and killed. And that's changed now. It's actually altering how we're gathering news, because people are not relying on freelancers or necessarily even hiring people in country because of fears of their safety. And I think that's what I wanted to move on to in terms of risk. This is something that I'm actually wanting to work on, because there isn't actually training for international correspondence in terms of how you protect sources or local journalists that you work with. Again, that phrase local journalist sounds a little bit patronizing. I'm just using it to differentiate between international journalists. We don't have training on that. We don't have training on how to talk to someone who is the survivor of a trauma or a child. And this is something I think needs to be a paradigm shift in international journalism coverage. We need to have, like, if you're going to send a correspondent somewhere, they need to know how to look after the people that they're working with, the risks that those people have, how you put people's lives in danger, and not just your own risk, not just your own flat jacket, not just your own helmet. That is beginning to change. People are thinking about that at the very least, but I mean everything down to physical safety to also technology. My phone is definitely tapped, and all the information. When I go into Gaza, I come back through Erez crossing. All my belongings are taken to a different room and gone through by the Israeli authorities. I need to think very carefully about if I have any sources there. How that action might impact them, and that's something that we are working to change. I think the audio will be for the next question. Yeah, and the final point in terms of risks, which is not quite specifically risks, but I think one of the things that international journalists probably risk doing is losing the truth of the story by trying to be objective. So I think this is something briefly that you were mentioning, but we sit on the fence, and that can sometimes basically mean that the truth of the story is clouded in our desperate attempt to try and give A and B, both sides of the story, a voice, and I think that can cause a change in narratives and a change in the story. So that's a slightly different point, but ultimately, yeah, we choose to be there. We do have a certain level of protection, and I think there is a shift that needs to happen and is happening in terms of how we look after the people that we work with who face greater risks than we do.
You're not doing the audio?
I'm going to do it for the next one.
I don't want to belabor this point so much because clearly the risks are real in Syria. The regime understood immediately that journalists and journalism, specifically within Syria, was going to be a threat. And I'm not interested in having a conversation about the risks to international journalists. No matter what, at the end of the day, like Syrian journalists were much more targeted. None of them are writing books, none about their risks and getting movies made about that. So like, I don't want to belabor that point. And I don't want to sit and feed into a victim narrative either, because despite all those risks, many Syrian journalists, many Syrian citizens became citizen journalists. They did their best to tell the world what was going on. People who just liked to take photography as a hobby became photographers and risked their lives for the wire services, who didn't necessarily reciprocate when the time came. So again, since we're colleagues here and we're in this profession, I'd rather us think about the things that we can do to mitigate those risks to them, rather than perform some kind of drama here about the risks to us or myself personally. Because at the end of the day, I also have an American passport, and fine, I'm not allowed in Syria, but I have other places that I am allowed into. I'm not affected by bans on Syrians, which is one of the vagaries of fate. So given that there are Syrians who are willing to take these risks and to try and to become journalists in a place where in a country where journalists are targeted and there is no study of journalism, and they sneak across the border to get trainings, we should think about how we can support them, how we can make those trainings more accessible to them, how we can help disseminate their stories and put their stories at the top, as opposed to the story of the one foreign journalist who gets in and who tells it that way. I'd rather us, just think about ways to redefine what risk means. I mean, I'm much more interested in the risk of not getting it right. And these are things that we as journalists can figure out, at least just acknowledge that there's all kinds of risks to us not getting it right, and how can we mitigate those risks. And part of, to go back to what I was saying earlier, like there is a great risk that journalism itself has been discredited to many people, and these disinformation campaign is something that is very important. Not all of us need to be running into Syria and covering a bombardment, as sexy as that is, and as whatever need that affirms inside of you. But there is something that we can do out here that is quite important, and that is to sort of counter these disinformation campaigns, to figure out how to take them apart. To reach the audiences that they've already reached, and sort of be able to play at that level, because the discrediting of journalism was something that the regime understood very early on and was able to play. And I think it was it was sort of made worse, exacerbated by the fact that there were a lot of people not getting the story right. So those are the risks I would encourage us in this room to think about, and then also think about the ways to sort of empower the journalists who are on the ground and who are willing to take that risk. Because it's not for us to tell you about all their risks and then we take away those risks. And if there are enough Italians in the room, ci sono quanti italiani ci sono? Okay, the Italian government is thinking about reopening its embassy in Damascus. It's the only European Union country to think about that. So that's also power to exercise there. So if it is going to, either work to not have it be opened, or work to have the legitimacy of journalists sort of reestablished there by having I don't know if in this government they're going to advocate on behalf of journalists, but one of the problems, pero you never know what happened, who comes next. But one of the things that has happened in Syria, I think Syria more than any of the other countries, and maybe also now Yemen, is this sort of, we have blown through all kinds of international norms, things that we would have never accepted, we have totally come to accept. And so we have to think about ways also to reestablish certain things, certain norms that, as a Syrian person who loves Syria, I just, we obviously completely failed on all of those fronts.
Okay, the risk of not getting the story right is very important. Lina, how do we deal with this risk? How do we get the story right? Being hopeful and all.
Don't make fun of me because I'm hopeful. It's the way to operate. But yeah, it's a hard one. It's a tough one. Also, this is actually one of our challenges because a lot of the times, for example, because we insist in investing in cultivating certain sources, in following through some tips towards some sensitive stories, which is not the kind of thing that is widely done these days in Cairo in terms of journalism. What happens is that a lot of the times the journalists are so scared to reveal their sources, especially if they are not on staff. And it takes a long time for us to work with them before we'd be able to publish something, because we need them to not necessarily reveal their sources to the entire newsroom, but the editor working on them, and to basically calibrate the extent to which this is a credible source, and then from there on to find a way to also corroborate the information through additional types of sourcing. So this has been one of our bigger challenges, and we've had to kill a lot of stories, even though our intuition and our gut feeling says that the information is right, but it just doesn't have enough sourcing. And we keep saying that this is very important for our credibility. Also, in the case we get into lawsuits and trials and so on, I want to be able to stand in front of the judges as the chief editor of this organization and say, I have very solid sourcing. I won't say it, but I have very solid sourcing for this information, and not to be also used in this narrative of disinformation, of us being propagators of disinformation. It's also particularly tough in Egypt these days because we are in a situation where we've been trapped a lot. So basically, some journalists will come our way. We've built this reputation of being the media that would take interesting tips and develop them, and they would give us totally wrong tips, the function of which would be to just set us up with the authorities. This has been happening a lot, and we've had to thicken our skins in saying no to very exciting ideas and tips recently because of that. So that's another important aspect. I feel that the calibration really happens through the fact that we function as a newsroom where there are several editors who would deal with difficult stories. So there is this bouncing off of each other, and there is this possibility of having access to a network of sources to which we would deal with sensitive information and be able to validate it. I guess that's been our main tool to fight disinformation. The last thing I'll say, that because we are living in a context where dissidence has become very hard, and there is mounting yet very tamed anger. I think a lot of the stories we get, especially from people who are not working closely with us, but from outside contributors, would be, for example, mobilized more by their anger towards the authorities as opposed to solid information. So you get that color. You get people basically injecting their own psycho-narrative into the story in a way that also needs this outside voice to sort of see the extent to which it feels credible. So you have to go through all these things, the fear of being trapped, the propaganda that people want to sometimes use you in, and the simple fact that it's very hard to sit down our journalists, especially the ones working on sensitive stories, and asking them, okay, so what are your sources? We're not going to do this on even Signal or secure communication. We're going to do it face to face with our phones in the fridges, but we have to break the sourcing down until we get to something solid. So yeah, it's taxing, but essential, I guess.
Okay, protecting sources, protecting your sources, protecting journalists, protecting stringers when you work in really dangerous places like Gaza, for example, people risking their lives. You want to play that with you?
Yeah. So I wanted to, like I said, I just come out of Gaza because we we did think that there might be another war, particularly as there's an Israeli election due next week. And I wanted to, partly because I am uncomfortable answering questions about risks, given that I'm an international journalist. I wanted to try and get some of my colleagues that I work with to speak out about what they go through. Colleagues specifically can't be here today because they can't get here. So I did reach out to Libyan colleagues I work with, but because of the lack of internet, we couldn't even get a message out of them. And there were also concerns there in terms of what the militia backlash would be if they were to highlight what they actually go through on a day-to-day basis. And I think that says it all. They can't even speak out about how difficult it is to do their job. But I did get voice messages from my colleague in Gaza, a journalist called Nadal, who I work with, who can't be here today because he can't leave Gaza, and he's never left Gaza because of the blockade. And he had a message basically because again, often the news headlines are dominated by how difficult it is for an international journalist to operate, or whatever's happened to them, or their narrative, dominates it. So I wanted to play audio from a message that he sent me sent you actually, via WhatsApp, because he can't be with us today. So one second. So he was saying, we've seen a lot of injuries and deaths in Gaza over the last year because of protests that have been going on between the border fence between Gaza and Israel. Paramedics and journalists have come under fire. 2 Gazan journalists have been killed. The UN has accused Israeli forces of committing possible war crimes. Israel has defended their actions, saying that the protests are not peaceful. For Palestinian journalists, they are also living under a blockade, so they can't even get hold of the equipment that we can. So Lena mentioned how, all of us foreign correspondents were turning up in bulletproof cars and helmets and goodness only knows, satellite phones and everything. Because of the dual use situation in terms of the blockade, they can't get black flak jackets or helmets. So in this audio, you can hear Nadal actually saying that some Palestinian correspondents actually wear saucepans on their head to protect against whatever's being fired at them. They have fake, when I work with Nadal, I have to bring him bulletproof vest for him to wear. If that wasn't the case, he'd cover the protest wearing a fake bulletproof vest, as in it doesn't have any plates, but just to try and identify himself, and it doesn't work. So I would like to be quiet now and leave it to Nadal's voice message to everyone here.
Gazan journalists lack equipment, and we are obliged to use just a normal vest with no protection. Press flag vests are not available unless foreign journalists loan this to us. It is too expensive for us to purchase. There is a Gazan journalist who used a saucepan for a helmet and a plastic breast bag in place of a bulletproof vest. International journalists are protected by insurance if something goes wrong, but not the Palestinians. As a Palestinian journalist, I strongly condemn the Israeli crimes against the Palestinian journalists and can't understand the international silence when a Palestinian journalist is killed, while killing an American or German journalist constitutes an international crime. In 2014, many journalists were killed and injured during the recording of the war situation in Gaza, risking their lives and being in the line of fire with not even basic protection like helmets. Safety is an ongoing struggle for Palestinian journalists, and still.
Actually, I'm thinking of opening the floor for questions, then we can comment, then we can... You want to? Okay. Okay. On the floors. Yeah, if you want to. Okay. Okay. Sure. Okay, I'm going to open the floor for a couple of questions, then we're going to go back so that I don't bore you to death. Anyone have any questions? Okay. Can we get a mic?
Thank you very much. Just I want to ask, there is risk for sure and danger from the authorities and dictatorship, but there is another threat also from the journalists, journalists and media who fake the truth, who maybe attacked you. So there is another side of risk. How you can deal with this? And there are media and journalists also.
Do you have another question? Okay, this one.
Who was the first?
Hi, was it a question for you actually? Yes, because you were saying before that, if I'm not wrong, you were hinting about the fact that people in like in the States, for example, don't know anything about like Syria or other places like in the Middle East and everything. Do you think that if we had knowledge, even like talking about probably maybe Iraq at the time, if there was more knowledge about these countries, would have we had? Would we had? Well, was there another outcome, you know, of the crisis that we went through, like, and the wars and what happened in Syria and what happened in Iraq and everything? Like, if the people were more concerned, you know, like protesting and stuff, because these things actually work sometimes, right? I'm sorry, I just got confused.
Okay, we have to. Okay.
Thank you for the panel. Question is really for the panel, and it's a question which is not really about the countries that were brought up. The country I have in mind is actually Saudi Arabia, and I'm wondering how we can tell the truth about Saudi Arabia if you know, you're talking about a regime which is very opaque, access is very limited, and sometimes access is granted to certain journalists who might privilege their own sources even though they're being manipulated. There's also the question of the level of proof necessary for something to appear on, let's say, the New York Times or the Washington Post, when it's simply, the evidence simply will not show up because there's no way to actually report with 100% accuracy when it's this kind. And this allows these regimes to really run loops around journalists. And sometimes we actually get, I mean, I'm an activist, I do journalism, but my first identity is that of an activist. Sometimes we get the warning signs many months before, and by the time we have the level of proof necessary for this to break into the news, the disaster is already too late. It's just too late. So is there any other method here to, you know, to report?
Okay, one last question, then we.
I'm from the Netherlands, and there is it's really common that the media is really independent. So I can't imagine thinking about if I'm going to write this, I maybe get killed or something like that, or I don't think about the risks because there are no risks. What is the biggest difference between, for example, a country, the Netherlands, and a country like Syria?
Okay. Okay. Great questions, everyone. Just to sum it up, the first question was about threats from propagandists and fake journalists whose voice is very, very loud in our countries. And the second is about the lack of knowledge or the lack of concern from certain audiences. And the third, which is you're a very intelligent audience, is about Saudi Arabia and the access being very, very limited to what comes out of Saudi Arabia. And it's for so many reasons, you know, that I mentioned before, basically dictators siding with the West and with, you know, like from Trump to MBS and in this, I mean, they work together, and there is a lot of money and power going on. And the fourth question was about the biggest difference between the Netherlands and Syria. So do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I'll take a stab on a couple of questions, but in terms of the threat of the journalists, the counter propaganda and all of that, my sense is that at least in the context of Egypt, there is a growing mistrust in the mainstream media, which I think is not specific to Egypt. That is perhaps our shield against all the smearing campaigns and the disinformation that get published about us or about anything, basically tarnishing the truth completely. So I feel that the fact that there are too many voices out there and a growing mistrust is actually rendering a lot of these campaigns quite ineffective. Now there are better machines for fake news and disinformation, but they don't exist, luckily, in my country, I think. But I stand to be contested on this. But really, I think also the evolution of the journalism landscape in the country and the fact that we've had a few years of relatively independent journalism where people saw what it means to have credible information or well-served and well-produced information, that when things became the way they are now, which is completely controlled, smearing campaigns all the time, one newspaper saying that I'm both Muslim Brotherhood person who was born and raised in Israel, which just doesn't make any sense. So I think the only outcome of this is just massive distrust, and the testament to this is the fact that a lot of the political television in Egypt is completely dying, and there's a loss of interest in that kind of information. I want to respond to your question. I don't know. My sense is the way international media have consistently treated the other or reduced the other to the crisis, in the sense that the showing up and the coverage and all of that is centered on the crisis, was the complete dropping of the time in between. I don't know if this would have, this focus on this in-between crisis, in-between time, would have changed the way people understand what's going on in our part of the world or other parts of the world, and hence act differently. But my sense is that there is just, as much as we say that our authoritarian regimes are resilient and so on, I feel like there is also a similar kind of resilience when it comes to international media, as in, they won't cover something that is not as strong as a war in Iraq or a beautiful revolution in Egypt. And I feel that this is a lot of the times, partially, I'm serving mostly a local audience, so I mean, it's not my priority, in all honesty, to tell the world what's happening about Egypt, but so it happens that we are a bilingual publication, so we do tell the world what's happening in Egypt. And I feel like a small function I serve in there is provide that document that is gone missing completely about Egypt 8 years after this revolution, because everyone has gone. All the journalists have left, all the newsrooms, the international newsrooms have been shut down. And I feel like I create that record because if something else big happens in Egypt in the next year or 2 or 10 years, people will need that context to understand how does this happen, because this revolution in Egypt or the revolution in Syria didn't come out of nowhere. These people were not just completely asleep and all of a sudden they decided to wake up and do a revolution. But in order for the world to understand these things, there needs to be a record, and so long as some of us can create it, we need to fight for it. Now, how much of this record is accessible, is making people pay attention? I have little trust, just because of the over-mediation we live in, and as much as it is a highly globalized world, it is also going in that opposite direction where everyone is just looking inward, and and a lot of the times sort of swimming in the exceptionalism of their own crisis. So it's a difficult time to be able to have this transnational sensibility of what's happening elsewhere affects me, or is a product of my government's practices and so on.
Okay, sorry, we're running out of time. Alia, you wanna?
Hey, I'll try to hit as many of these as possible. First, on the question about other journalists, so the propagandists attacking journalists, that's so much happening in the Syrian context, and that was something I was referring to when I was talking about the disinformation campaigns. And, we will not name them, but there are two journalists in particular, one a Canadian, one a British one, who were like really remarkable agents of disinformation in what happened in Syria. And I have found that there are two ways that we need to approach this and the defenses to this. Part of it has grown out of the fact because everyone started looking at Syria through the eyes of only 2011. So it becomes, you know, irrational to understand, why would a regime that is, you know, supposedly secular, why would they attack their own people? Why would they be the one to use the chemical weapons when they're already winning? Why would they do this? Why would they do that? Especially when we know the US did this in Iraq. And so we end up having these binary conversations, and people fall into the trap a lot because they start engaging with what is not the real conversation. And one of the things I have found the most powerful as a way to block against this is, ironically, the regime has, I mean, since they've been around for 50 years, you have 50 years of history, like, and they are quite consistent. And it's very hard to argue with a bibliography that's like this long. And if you can go back and trace when these patterns began, when these fault lines were laid, and how these are consistent with the way that they have ruled, then it's pretty hard to enter into that debate, which is why, like, Partisan Girl and these other people don't even, like, touch me, because, like, I'm not going to get into that yelling fight. And the second way I think we have to understand the way disinformation works is, I don't know how many of you guys as journalists look at communication theory, but it's something I've sort of looked at as I've tried to teach my students this. And a lot of how we communicate and what we post and why we read the stories that we read is because they reaffirm who we think that we are. So somehow, like in the Syrian story, in the camp that is called progressive or leftist in the United States, to some extent, has gotten ownership of the idea of pushing back against American imperialism, and they've somehow failed to then actually see Syrians as like people with their own agency. I've been told 1 minute, so I've got to answer this really quickly. As for the U.S., it's not just that there was a lack of knowledge vis-a-vis the Arab and the Muslim world. There was the affirmative presence of a lot of bad knowledge, like a lot of dehumanizing knowledge. And do I think it could have all gone differently if the Arabs and Muslims existed in the American imagination differently? Yes. Holland and Syria. My partner's half Dutch. I actually have to go to Holland a lot. And it's a lovely, wonderful country when it's not raining and when you can find food that isn't Dutch to eat. But it's an amazing country. I'm also like following Syrian refugees who've been there now, and they're in the 4th year of their life. I will tell you, the biggest difference is citizenship is not an empty notion, okay? Because the citizen, it means something to be a citizen of Holland. It means nothing to be a citizen of Syria. Because to be a citizen is not to, you and every other Dutch person in theory has the same rights, and it is the state that will protect your rights. That is not the situation in Syria. I mean, you asked for one thing. I mean, I could give you like lists. Herring being one of them, but otherwise, but like in a big notion, it's the idea of citizenship and that it means something.
I think we haven't answered the question about how to tell the truth about Saudi Arabia, correct? Yeah. So I would say it's incredibly hard, and I actually think that probably of all the countries, this is going to be a big statement I'm about to make, all the countries in the Middle East, I'd say it's probably the one that hasn't probably got the best reporting on it, and access has been an issue. And this, you know, this is a problem that actually Western journalists in particular suffer from, and myself, I include this in this bracket, is I guess you could say, I think you mentioned this in terms of exoticism, but like orientalizing. So Saudi Arabia has always been this kind of, I don't want to use the word amusing because that sounds like I'm not taking it seriously, but this bizarre country where, you know, they publicly execute people with swords, and like, you know, women were banned from driving, the only country in the world that was. And I think basically, I'm just being told time is up, that's massively impacted people's ability to be able to properly report on Saudi Arabia. People not under, you know, just a lack of complete understanding, and also a lack of access. And I think just a final point here is that, yeah, I mean, we still got quite a long way in terms of international journalism reporting on the Middle East to not see it as an other, to not, I mean, there's always, you know, sort of, yeah, I'm finishing, yeah. Basically, we need to stop looking at these countries as otherizing them, and be able to actually report on them as we report on our own countries, and have a bit more knowledge.
Okay, I really have to close because the building is closing. But just one more sentence. You know, when you talk about